Everyone. My name is Abigail Salazzo. I'm the Chapters and Leadership Manager here at ANFP. Thank you all so much for joining us today. As you may know, we are going to cover some areas related to leadership, recruitment, and retention. And joining us for today's call is Omar Hume. He is the current president of the North Carolina chapter. The North Carolina chapter board has undergone a transformation with leadership, and that's led them to be a very strong and successful chapter. They were also one of this year's finalists for the coveted Diamond Award. So you'll be hearing from Omar throughout the program. So welcome, Omar. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah. So just before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that it's that time of year again where the Nutrition and Food Service Education Foundation is seeking chapter support for the Foundation's annual appeals with this annual Chapter Champions program. Your presidents and treasurers of each chapter should have already received a personalized letter from the chair of the Foundation, Mary Hannah Shue, along with the giving levels and the donation form. So if you haven't, maybe reach out to your chapter president and treasurer and ask them if they've gotten that, and you know, maybe consider that as something that you wish to donate to. Some reasons that you may want to become a chapter champion: you're really showing your chapter support for the NFEF, and their goal is to raise the visibility of the CDM credential. So that really benefits everybody. Also, if your chapter happens to donate $400 or more by October 31st, the chapter will be entered into a drawing for 4 tickets to SeaWorld Parks and Resorts. And those tickets, they can be used while visiting Orlando, which many of you know, ACE 2018 will be taking place there. And you know, we certainly need and appreciate your support. And if you're at your fall meeting again, you may want to ask your board if you hadn't received that communication yourself, and just you know, let them know what being a chapter champion is really all about. And just a side note here, for those of you that are writing checks for chapter champion programs, we do ask that you do submit those checks within 30 days of the date. Sometimes we may approve a donation, but the check may not be sent in for, you know, a couple months. So we just want to be sure that we're everybody's books kind of sync up together. So if you do have any questions about becoming a chapter champion, please contact Mindy Feasfield, and her email is here on the screen. For those of you that are calling in, it's mfeasfeld@anfponline.org. Go ahead and shoot her an email if you have any questions. And then I do want to note today that this particular chapter chat can count towards your leadership session, which is now a new requirement of chapter rebates. We are asking that one chapter leader attend at least one leadership session. And again, this one can count towards that. However, we are going to be taking attendance. So if you haven't logged into the web portion, I don't think your name will appear on our end. So please go ahead and shoot me an email right now if you're in front of a computer, just letting me know that you are here today and that you're present, because we do want to be sure that we can account for that part of the rebate. Okay, with that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and we'll dive in. So today, by the end of the program, you're going to be able to identify the steps of succession planning, understand strategies to recruit and retain volunteers in your leadership roles, list strategies for conflict management as well as resolution, and then be able to understand what it takes to revitalize a board. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with succession planning, this is really a means for an organization or your chapter to ensure its continued effective performance through leadership continuity. I know that's kind of a lot of fancy words to throw out there, but really it's a means to keep your chapter strong and going in a successful manner. For a chapter to plan for replacement of key leaders, potential leaders, they need to be first identified and prepared to take on those roles which have already been done. So that's really what succession planning is about, is to be sure that you're prepared for the future. Now, most chapters have already completed this first step here. You may have some seasoned members on your board or new members, but most of your board members are engaged. They're typically motivated and they're usually enthusiastic, not only about what they're doing, but about the success of the chapter. If they're not your first step is to reach out to those that are not engaged or they're not participatory, and ask them, what's keeping them from being active leaders? Ask if they're even still interested in serving in a leadership role. And then if they are, ask them to continue to participate, willingly, and of course, as their schedule allows. And depending on their response, your chapter may or may not need to find some replacements for those leaders that maybe no longer have the time and they no longer wish to serve. And in doing this, you may delay your development of your succession plan, but I do feel it's very important to have each of your leaders engaged and willing and wanting to be there and supportive of the entire process. So Omar, I'm going to ask you to jump in here and just kind of give your thoughts and your experience with engaging your senior leaders.
Yep, sorry about that. So just to kind of start off where you mentioned getting the senior leaders engaged, the first thing that I would suggest doing is a SWOT, which is a strength, weakness, opportunity of your chapter. And what I did in North Carolina was I did my own myself first, and then we did one as a board, and then we did one as a chapter. What that does is it gives you an opportunity to first examine on a one-to-one basis where you are as a chapter, and then once you gauge where you think you are, you get to hear everyone else's feedback and then come up with a plan going forward.
Great, yes, and I'm so glad you brought this up, Omar. We actually use SWOT analysis with our chapters when we conduct chapter visits. We want to hear from them what they think their strengths, their weaknesses, their opportunities, and their threats are as a chapter. So it's a great assessment tool to really understand where your board members think maybe your chapter is or your board is. And as Omar said, he did this as a self-assessment too. So this is a great tool to use. Those of you that are unfamiliar with it, I'm happy to share information how to conduct that. We do have a facilitator's guide if you wanted to do that as a group, or again, if you want to do that as a self-assessment. So great.
Abigail, also on that, let me interject real quick. On that same point, when you do the SWOT, you have to be completely honest with yourself and as a chapter about where you are. Because if you're not 100% honest, you're not going to get the information from it that you need.
Yes, agreed. And so when we are preparing to visit a chapter and we ask them to do the SWOT analysis, we actually have them do the pre-work ahead of time. And this is for a couple of reasons. One is we want to understand the chapter better. We don't want to, see these results when we're on site and not have time to prepare better for those visits. But another reason we do this is because it allows each of the chapter board members to respond anonymously and we hope very candidly. So they can be as open and honest with those responses, whether they're good or they're bad. So yeah, that's a great point, to be very honest and candid with your responses. Great. So we also, in addition to engaging our leaders, we certainly want to be sure our members, whether they're new or veteran members, they need to be engaged as well. We want to be sure our members are interested, they're engaged, and they're excited about volunteering. It's just as important as having your senior leaders in that same frame of mind. We can do this by regularly offering opportunities to help or volunteer. That's a great way to get your members involved and engaged. Once they start that first step in volunteering, we're essentially setting them on that path to eventually step into some leadership roles. And just want to point out here, another great way to keep your members engaged is through regular communication. Maybe it's through your newsletter, maybe it's on social media. I feel like many of you have probably heard this from me over and over again, but it kind of begs to be repeated, that your members feel more in touch when you are hearing from your leaders regularly. And then, of course, our volunteers themselves, we want to be sure we're engaging them no matter what their role is, big or small. Ensure that we recognize their efforts, check in with them regularly. Certainly ask for their input as to what would make it easier to serve in a role or what would be more efficient way of doing things. perhaps there's other training that they've thought of that would have provided, that we could have provided, and how they may want to improve things, either for themselves in the following year in the same role or as the new volunteer comes in. And encourage them to, reach out to one another as volunteers, or say you have a treasurer in the role, encourage them to reach out to past treasurers, have them swap ideas, challenges. Maybe there's some best practices that weren't passed along. This is just a great way to keep your volunteers engaged, but it also gives them the opportunity to exchange information. So again, Omar, if you can just let us know how you've gotten your chapter volunteers and members more engaged.
Yep, sure will. So my approach is probably a little different than some people may use. What I found is, when you're trying to get new volunteers, everyone wants to see change, but everybody's afraid. A lot of people are afraid to get engaged. So what we did was, one of the approaches we took was starting committees. You can start a hospitality committee. We started if somebody came up with a great idea and it was something that we felt like it benefited the chapter, then it was a committee. And the byproduct of that is chapter engagement and nurturing new leaders. So the other part of it is, if people are not willing to volunteer, then I'm notorious for putting people on the spot and saying, hey, you know what, that's a great idea. You're the new chair of this committee, and we'll give you all the support you need to go forward. The other part of it is transparency is something that I found over the last year and a half, that the more transparent you are with people, the more apt they are to become engaged and want to be leaders.
Yes, I can't agree with you more, Omar. I think that's a fabulous idea, starting small, even with something like the hospitality committee. That's actually, I'm sure that's kind of what you want to call a fun committee. They probably get to do a lot of, unique things and get a little creative. So that's a great stepping stone into, a little bit more challenging, difficult leadership roles. So, So those of you, maybe struggling to find volunteers, just as Omar said, translating those ideas into committees or task forces. That's a great way to get people, have them get their feet wet just for that little bit. They'll get a taste of volunteering, and hopefully they'll just work their way up into those leadership roles. That's wonderful. Okay, we're going to keep moving here. And certainly, if your current leader or future leader, you're going to need to understand your chapter's needs. A very simple way to do this is starting with a member satisfaction survey, or as Omar mentioned, also SWOT analysis. You'll really understand some of your chapter needs as well. But you're going to want to understand what you're doing well and what you need to improve upon. And surveys can really allow your members, again, to express their concerns or their frustrations candidly as well as anonymously. I know sometimes we don't always get the feedback that maybe we need, but we want to be sure that we're giving them the correct opportunity for our members to do that. They may not be as honest if they know that their name is going to be attached to an evaluation or an email. So give them that opportunity at least once a year. You also want to consider asking your volunteers, specifically those that have not volunteered, what are their barriers from keeping them from doing so? What do they need? What's it going to take for them to step up and volunteer? And then by understanding these volunteer and these member needs, it's also going to help you determine what leadership you may need in the future. So if you're looking to continue to expand on perhaps your presence at community fairs, college fairs, do you need a task force for that? And if so, there's another great volunteer opportunity that maybe somebody is interested in doing that. Omar, how have you been able to better understand your own chapter needs? I know you mentioned the SWOT analysis, but has there been any other sort of evaluation or assessment done with your chapter?
Yeah, so what we did tied into the SWOT, as we were doing the SWOT analysis, we listened to what people were saying, and then we doubled back on the items that seemed to keep reoccurring, i.e. Programming. People were saying, well, we want to come, but what's the value in of us coming? So the feedback that we generated from doing the SWOT was our verbal kind of analysis to where we were and what we needed to do as a chapter.
Great.
From at the end of each meeting, we do a survey, a wrap up, and we ask questions. You know, did you find value for this meeting? What can we do differently to make it better for you? You know, what would prohibit you from attending the meetings? Those kinds of things. And we got the feedback from them also.
Great. So you're really digging down deep, you know, trying to figure out those barriers that's what's keeping them from attending. And that's really where the value is in surveys, is not so much as to what they're satisfied with, but what they're unsatisfied with. How can we remedy those situations and those errors or those issues that we're having with our members? So yeah, again, that SWOT analysis tool is a great tool, and I'll be sure to share that with our chapter leaders following the call. And then, of course, as Omar had mentioned earlier, a board self-assessment. Doesn't necessarily have to be a SWOT. There are a number of tools out there where you can self-assess your board, and as an individual to do the same thing. You may want to ask, you know, questions as yourself is how have you contributed? What's the impact you've made? And what have you gained in the leadership role? If you want to continue to serve, what is it that you're hoping to see with your chapter be accomplished? How would you like to contribute? So those things can not only be asked as to individuals, but as your chapter board as well. And even your chapter as a whole, if you like. But again, we can't really understand what our chapter needs unless we're asking them directly. Great. And then, of course, once we have these responses and, you know, we see what we're up against, you're going to want to start to develop your volunteers as well as your leaders. You know, because you've done the self-assessment or the board assessment, you want to consider what the skills they currently have, and then, of course, the skills that they need in order to succeed in whatever role it is they're taking on. What are their strengths, their weaknesses, and how do we ensure that they're receiving the right training to fill that knowledge gap? Consider having your up-and-coming future leaders. So maybe those that are incoming in the following year, have them take the self-assessment as well. So you're ready to hit the ground running. They've had that time prior to jumping in office, and they have that time to develop those skills. So say, for example, if they want to improve their organizational skills, perhaps they're stepping into the secretary's role, you know, suggest having them starting to keep to-do lists, setting reminders when deadlines are on their calendars. Even better, have them start to review board minutes. Board minutes should really be looked at as a planning tool or as a to-do list. You know, they can go through that and you can see from one set of minutes to the next set of minutes what's been accomplished and what still needs to be completed. So, you know, help them develop that organization skills, whether or not they are natural at it or if that does need some improvement. So Omar, again, can you give us maybe an example of something like that? Somebody that stepped into a role that was maybe a little hesitant, and then you as a board helped them develop those skills that they needed to fulfill that role?
Yep. Our current treasurer, actually, that just took office was that exact person. He was the kind of person that when we had a meeting, he always showed up. He'd do whatever it took to help, you know, get ready. He'd stuff goodie bags. He'd help with registration, but he never wanted to run for an office. And we kind of pulled him to the side and say, look, you know, we need you as a leader for the future. And if you'll run and if you win the election, we'll support you in any way possible. And actually, he was with me yesterday. We partnered with the North Carolina Restaurant and Lodging Association, and he was the first one there yesterday to help me. So that just speaks to the kind of person he is, but he just needed a little bit of a nudge to step into a leadership position.
Right. Yes. Agreed. Sometimes it is just that nudge, or as you said earlier, Omar, is you kind of put people on the spot, you know, and I think I don't want everybody to badger their members to volunteer, but you know, when you ask very pointedly, I think that's a good approach, you know, and give them that little push that they need. I've taken on some volunteer roles for that exact reason. You know, somebody come up to me directly and asked me or said, given me that little push of encouragement, and then I have stepped into that role. And I'm probably not the best person to maybe say this, but maybe Omar, you can speak better into this. I always feel with our chapters leaders that as CDMs, they have many skills within their jobs that I feel can be applicable to what they do as a chapter leader. As CDMs, you often have to have great communication skills. You're often looked to as coaches or mentors because you're training employees. You need to be organized. So many of the skills that you already hold can be applied to your chapter leadership role. So that may be one way to paint that picture for some of your prospective volunteers. And again, I'm not the expert when it comes to the day-to-day of a CDM, so maybe Omar, you can explain how some of your skills had transferred over to your leadership role.
No, well, I totally agree with that. We are the leaders in our department. We're one of the key components of the facilities that we work in, and we motivate and lead people every day. So just think about it that when you manage your own staff, you don't manage every employee the same way. You use a different management practice to manage every employee. And what I mean by that is, you may have one employee that only responds to, if you don't do your job, there are repercussions for your actions. Or you may have that employee that, with just a little bit of extra encouragement, they'll go in and clean the whole kitchen for you. Transfer that over to your chapter. You have to look at the people within your chapter, get to know the members, and then you know what buttons to push to get them engaged. Going back to what I said earlier about putting people on the spot, when I do that, I don't necessarily always say, oh, I want you to serve this position. Think about when you have meetings or you have something, there's always, if you look around the room, people usually sit in their own little comfortable cliques. Jim and John always sit together every meeting. You got 3 or 4 ladies that always sit at the same table. They always have the same conversation. So generally what I've done is I'll say, hey, you know what? I need you to be the committee chair. And then their friends will start laughing. And then I'll say, and you can pick 3 members to assist you. So immediately, who do they pick? They pick their friends. So in my mind, I've already got it those are the people I want on that committee. And I give them, I empower them to select the members they want to help them, and they immediately do it because those are their peers that they're comfortable with. So immediately, we've already broken the ice of leadership, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I've read this in a couple of articles that most people tend to volunteer because their friends are doing it. So, right there is the proof in the pudding. You're asking somebody to chair and you're empowering them, allowing them to make the decision as to who sits on that committee. And you're correct. They're going to pick the people they're most comfortable with. So, but then right there you have 2, 3, 4 new volunteers already right in place. That's wonderful. Great. Okay, so keep going. We're going to keep going here. Next step would be recruitment. And I've said this many times, recruitment is an ongoing process. It's a team effort, whether it's through your membership committee, perhaps you have a pre-professional committee that's recruiting, or maybe it's one-on-one. Members should continually be reminded and as well as offered opportunities either from your micro-volunteering or to managing the annual chapter meeting. You certainly want to keep your eye out for potential volunteers or leaders. Send out that survey or call for volunteers. Try to do that at least a couple times a year. At the same time, be sure you're gauging the interest among your members. And if they're not willing, again, I think we just kind of touched on this a little bit. Ask what's holding them back. What's the barrier? Is it time? Is it something that a volunteer role doesn't interest them? So ask what's going on with them. See what you can help resolve to get them to volunteer. And then, of course, certainly think of some ways to recruit that are a little bit more out of the box. Ask your members to start bringing a friend to a meeting. Consider targeted events for pre and allied professionals. Maybe just keep it, fun and light, a social hour, maybe a brown bag lunch event. Consider some service projects for your current as well as your non-members. And then, of course, offering discounts and vouchers for meeting, which I know many of our chapters do to entice those prospective members or volunteers. Again, just don't wait until the last minute. Recruitment is an ongoing process, and you really need that for the leadership succession as well as the development to keep your chapter sustainable. So I'll open this up to anybody. What are some strategies that you all have used for recruiting volunteers? Feel free to use the chat function too if you'd like.
Abigail, this is Dorothy. And one of the things Minnesota had done in the past was it was the treasurer that didn't have to pay registration for the fall conference because of the amount of work that they've done. And we've changed that so it's all the board members, and we're finding that they're more willing to get involved and take responsibility for a section of the annual meeting. And
right, because they're getting the benefit, right?
For the many hours that they've put in,
right,
as a chapter leader.
Right, yes, they're being rewarded, correct, yes, and that's another point we'll touch on a little bit later today, but yeah, absolutely. Anytime you can reward or incentivize your volunteers, you know, we may not all be financially equipped to do what Minnesota does, but there are definitely other ways to incentivize your volunteers and recognize them for their efforts. So that's a wonderful recruitment tool. Anybody else have any recruitment strategies they'd like to share? No? Okay. We're going to keep plugging along here. So next step, we're going to want to train these volunteers. Without the proper training and a full understanding of what their role is and, of course, the expectations of those roles, our volunteers are already set up for failure and frustration. So let's just start simple and start by giving them the role description. Make sure they understand each of the responsibilities, the expectations, and how to do those, how to accomplish those. Let them know where they can find the resources for volunteers, and certainly give them a main point of contact. You know, whether that's a former officer, maybe it's somebody you can connect with within another chapter. Certainly I know most of our chapter leaders are more than willing to talk to one another about their own experiences and offer advice and guidance to maybe somebody that's new to the role, whether or not they're in the same chapter. And then when your incoming officers have been determined, you can try to assign them a mentor. It's just going to depend on the size of your chapter. If you have, you know, chapter leaders that are willing to do that, I do think it is one of the better training tools because you're getting that direct interaction with somebody that's been there, done that. But again, it might not always be feasible. So again, consider those outside of your chapter. Certainly give National a call if you have questions. I'm happy to coach people along as they take on a new role. Another step that I do think is also important, which I hope most of our chapters are doing this, if not all of them, and that's to provide an orientation. No matter how small or difficult or large the job is, we want to be sure that they're, you know, given that opportunity to ask questions about the role, make sure they feel secure in what they're doing, make sure that we're checking in with them regularly, and that we're offering the support. If it's more of a leadership role versus a committee role, but even then so, we want to be sure we're, you know, doing such things as reviewing those chapter governing documents, your strategic plan and your goals, financial reports. We want to be sure we're familiar with all of this as somebody stepping into a new chapter leadership role. So those are just some things you want to keep in mind as you're bringing people on board and you're training them. And I always try to look at this from an outside perspective, which can be hard to do, and I'm sure I'm not getting it right 100% of the time. And that's when I try to sit back and say, okay, I'm a new chapter leader. I've never done this before. What are the questions that I have? And I can certainly try to, you know, guess at that and come up with documents and tools to provide to those new volunteers. But there's really nothing better than having somebody be able to sit with them and go over everything. And that's where an orientation can come in, or a mentorship can come in as well. So Omar, how did you get your new members trained in their roles?
So new members are paired with outgoing positions. So the president-elect is paired with the president, the incoming treasurer is paired with the treasurer, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we implemented last year was I asked everyone on the board to go through and make a detailed list, an itinerary or an outline of everything they did in their position, so that when we transferred power to the next person, they had a template to follow by. Because one of the things that we keep hearing in the chapter is people are saying, I'd like to volunteer, but I don't know what to do. It's got to be hard, or I don't have the time to do it. So, we talked about it in our board meeting and decided that if people had a template to follow, then the position or the opportunity to volunteer wouldn't be so overwhelming, because they would see that it doesn't take 40 hours a month. It doesn't take 60 hours a month. You can put that in if you desire, but really, if you follow the template, it doesn't require a lot of time.
Great. And then prior to this, when you didn't have those templates in place, Omar, what was kind of the protocol at that point?
Same thing. It was peer development. So they were tiered with someone that was already in that position trying before them.
Okay.
So member orientation.
Right. And the reason I ask is because I think some of our chapters are probably not quite where North Carolina's chapter is right now. So, I guess for me, being here in National, I would think one of the first places you would look if you didn't have those same opportunities that the North Carolina chapter is, reach out to us. We have a volunteer handbook that has a lot of information in there, and then give us a call, or, again, reach out to your other chapter leaders throughout the nation. I think any one of them would be more than happy to sit with you and, give you some pointers as to how to succeed in that role. And then eventually, as you grow as you develop your succession plan, you will want to have something in place, that protocol and those processes and procedures in place, similar to the North Carolina chapter, where they have that template, and everything is kind of written out for them and what they need to do. We have a checklist available out on ANFP Connect that's broken down per role about each of the responsibilities they are to fulfill. And you can add dates to that. So there's some tools out there available for those that don't have that kind of training in place at this time. And we just had a question come through on chat, Omar, asking if you'd be willing to share your templates. And you don't have to answer that now. I don't want to put you on the spot. And I can follow up with you after the call.
All right.
Okay.
Abigail,
okay,
one thing
great.
I want to say is, can I jump in for a second? One thing I want to say is, by no means is North Carolina perfect, or do we have it down. It's still a work in progress. A lot of the things you hear me talking about are things that we've only implemented over the last year and a half. So as we work through the process, things that work, we keep plugging, and we may come up with an idea, and we may out of the box, and we see it doesn't work, and we kind of retool it. But just like in our departments, you're the CEO of your department. So as a board, if the board approaches the chapter with that same concept that, we need to make sure that the chapter succeeds, initially you're going to have people that are not going to be on the same page. You're going to have people that have been doing it for a while that will probably say, well, this is the way we've always done it. You just got to push through that and work together, and eventually you guys will continue. You'll start to get everybody on the same page and move forward. But by no means is it rocket science, or is it cut and dry that we've got it down pat, because we don't. There's still opportunities for improvement, and we're just trying to get it right for the people that succeed us. That's what we constantly say. The people that come behind us, we want to make sure it's easier for them.
Right. No, exactly. And, I think for those that are listening on the call today, later on, we'll hear from Omar kind of how he's revitalized his board in that chapter, along with his other board members, from where they started to where they are now. It's just I was really blown away when I had first heard all about it. So that's why I thought Omar would be perfect for this call. But again, it kind of gives you an example that if you're struggling now, you're not always going to be struggling. And you will have that trial and error period with, many different things about what may work for your chapter, may not work for every chapter. So that's a great point. Thanks, Omar, for bringing that up. Okay, and then of course, we want to monitor, evaluate our volunteers, not just our new ones, but our veteran ones. We're going to continue to check in with them regularly, certainly offer help and guidance if we can. We want to be sure we're checking in on statuses of projects, depending on if they're time sensitive or not, or, just in general. And of course, ask, if there's anything they need. Do they need additional funds? Do they need additional time? Do they need additional volunteers? Sometimes they might be afraid to ask or approach the board for those things. So as chapter leaders, that is our responsibility to be proactive and ask those questions. And then, of course, just as Dorothy mentioned earlier, we want to reward and recognize our volunteers. I certainly wish that I could do more. There are some things in the work for next year to let our volunteers that we just, we can't tell you enough how much we appreciate everything that you do for your chapter. And I certainly hope that you're being recognized within your chapter, not only through national, but your members are recognizing your efforts. No matter how big or small, whether you're recognized in the newsletter, on social media, or maybe you even want to think about doing something on a grander scale, hosting a volunteer appreciation event. We do this at annual. Unfortunately, not everybody's able to attend annual, but if you do get the opportunity, we have a volunteer appreciation luncheon. It's a great time for all of us to connect throughout the country. And we give awards out, and it's always a really nice lunch, and just one very small way that we can show our appreciation to our volunteers. And when we reward our volunteers, it's going to give them incentive to continue volunteering and give recognition, motivation, inspiration for all their efforts that they've done, and in hopes that this encourages some new volunteers to step up into the role. So definitely something to keep in mind there. Omar, what are some ways that the North Carolina chapter recognizes your volunteers?
We do, first of all, we do a whole member appreciation at every meeting. So we do what we call a partner reception. It is a reception where everybody can come in, let their hair down, get together, just network. And then throughout the meeting, we recognize each one of the members on the board. And then throughout the year, when we have our board meeting, we generally do something, whether it be a luncheon. This year, we have a holiday reception planned, just little things like, we're at the national meeting, we picked up watches for everybody. Just a little something, a little token of appreciation to say thank you, for the work that you're doing. It can be a bag of candy. The one thing about people is, if it's from the heart and it's genuine, then people will receive it better than just somebody doing something as a token of, I have to do something to show appreciation. So there's no wrong way to show appreciation to the men.
Right. Agreed. And I like you said, it's really the thought behind it that counts, and that you're recognizing those volunteers and you're taking a moment to think about them and saying, hey, thank you. I appreciate everything you're doing. So, just as Omar said, it doesn't have to be huge and grand. It is sort of those little things that count, and they really tend to add up. Anybody else on the call have some ways that you would like to share how you reward your volunteers? I know we heard from Dorothy. Anybody else? No? Okay. All right, so we're just going to dive a little bit deeper here into recruitment. This is obviously one of our biggest challenges. This is what I hear from our members that they, wish they had more training on and more guidance with. So we're going to tackle this here for a minute. And I feel like we've discussed this many times, but it never hurts to go over again. So here's some strategies we're going to discuss. Some of you may or may not be familiar with member campaign, member get a member campaign. And this encourages your active or your current members to reach out to those in their network or around them to become active members along with them. So for instance, an active member, they would ask a non-member to come to the meeting with them, hopefully that non-member joins. And then often the original member will be incentivized for that. So maybe their name gets thrown into a raffle to win free registration at the next fall meeting. But it's really kind of a unique situation in that it's a win-win for all. So you get a new member, which benefits the chapter. You're incentivizing the member that recruited the new member. And then, of course, your new member is going to gain all those benefits as joining part of the chapter. So this is a great campaign. You might want to challenge your members to think of somebody within their circle, whether it be at work or personal life, that may consider joining either ANFP or perhaps they're already a CDM, but they are not an active chapter member. Again, we've touched on this earlier in the call, asking one-on-one. This is really tends to be the time you get the best results. An invitation rather than pleading with your members usually works better. You want to point out maybe how their skills they currently have, as we spoke about earlier, you know, the skills that they use in their day-to-day job and how those can be transferred into the leadership roles. You know, they're not having to start over from the very bottom. They already currently possess the skills that they need to succeed in these roles. Or depending on what the role is, maybe they're gaining a new skill. So they're building off of the current skills they have. And that's always good for anybody. You know, I don't think anybody on this call or within our membership would really frown upon gaining a new skill. Even better, if you want to ask, what would they like to learn or gain as a volunteer? You know, maybe something they say kind of triggers that, and you think, hey, I've got the perfect volunteer position for this person. So taking the time to discuss opportunities with potential volunteers at one-on-one, I think is a great way to tackle some recruitment. You might want to think about a volunteer panel or roundtables at your next meeting. Let your members that are not volunteering, or maybe they are volunteering, let them hear from volunteers in the leadership position. What have your volunteers gained? What's something that they've really enjoyed about it? What was something that was unexpected? Give them that opportunity to let the membership know how their own experience has helped to shape them or shape the chapter. A lot of times people can relate to those human interest pieces on a personal level that can get them to volunteer. You know, many of us volunteer maybe outside of ANFP related to things that are near and dear to our heart. So if you're an animal lover, maybe you volunteer in animal shelter. But take your experience as a CDM and as a volunteer with ANFP and make it personal. Show them how that's impacted your own life. And then, of course, social media. This is an everyday and every shape or form way to recruit, specifically Facebook. I know a lot of us struggle with recruiting and retaining millennials or the younger generation. But you should know most of them are on Facebook. So for those of you that are not, or you're reluctant to put your chapter on Facebook, just know that this is really the way that you can connect very easily with those millennial members. They're the most frequent users of Facebook. Some of them use Instagram, Twitter, but really Facebook is the more dominant one. And those of you that are familiar with that, you know how tagging works. If you like a post, if you share a post, you know, when you do that, that comes up in your feed on your Facebook page, and you've ultimately reached people that you may never know are out there. So it's free, easy advertising, and hopefully recruitment. And last, we want to make this fun. You don't want to make recruiting this big drag. Certainly there's business to take care of, and you need roles to fulfill, things need to be done, but you really want to make the experience enjoyable. And not only for yourself, but for your prospective volunteers. So sometimes it's okay to separate that business. Think about hosting these social events like a wine and cheese event, potluck, a picnic. Take the business out of it. Start to build those relationships with your prospective volunteers, get to know them on a personal level. As we talked about earlier in the call, just as Omar said, you know, people are more likely to volunteer when they're volunteering with their friends. So if they know somebody on a personal level and that person approaches them to step into a volunteer role, they're more likely to do it. So maybe start off, you know, getting to know those people, having fun with them, and further on down the line, you sort of prime them to be willing to step into that volunteer role. What are anything anybody wants to add there? These are just some quick strategies. I know people are struggling with recruitment. Any questions? No? Okay. Omar, anything that you'd like to add there? I know we kind of touched on a number of these throughout the call.
Yeah, I mean, just with recruitment, one of the things we tried, and once again, it's trial and error, but one of the things we tried was, if you bring 3 members to the next meeting, we'll give you free registration. Another one we did was we gave away a spa treatment at the meeting before that, because it was the one where they had a spa. It's a matter of finding what works. And I'll be honest, what works one time may not work the next time.
Right, right. Do you ever find that if you ask somebody once and they say no, and then you maybe revisit that person a little while later, that something kind of changes for them, that they're willing to step into roles? Our biggest thing in terms of recruitment has been the culture change, and that's my favorite word, is culture. With the culture change, our recruitment piece has been generated because people have seen value in what we're doing. They also see they feel the buzz, they feel the energy, and they're starting to really want to become a part of what we do. And that in turn becomes our best form of recruitment, which is word of mouth. Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, those that can share their experience and say, hey, this has been a great opportunity for me. You should think about doing it. Yeah, for sure. Word of mouth is a great way to get people to volunteer and step up. Great. Great. Okay, running short on time, so I'm just going to quickly go through some conflict resolution tools, and then I want to pass things over to Omar because he has just a great story to share. And I just want to address conflict management. I know that, many of us have different personalities. We face challenges, and it's often the reason that we can't retain board members or volunteers. I've heard sometimes, it's cliquey, or, there's some gossip going on. So we want to be able to address those topics. We want to make sure that you can resolve those issues, and then we can act in a professional manner, and we can retain those volunteers and those board members so there's not this constant turnover. The first step is always the hardest, and that's to identify there's a conflict. This is not easy to do, especially if you're a part of the problem. But again, there's various conflicts that are going to arise with your board or your membership. They could be lack of communication with other board members, perhaps it's failure to complete projects or tasks, even difference of opinion. So definitely different things. However, whatever it is, you've really got to face it, you have to own it, and you've got to be prepared to address it in a non-defensive way with maybe it's the board, your membership, or as an individual. It's going to be uncomfortable, most likely. Most people don't want to face up to this kind of stuff, myself included. But it's really the only way that you can start to begin to resolve that. And if you happen to be a mediator during these conversations, whether it's between 2 people, it's between 2 groups, whether it's between your membership, you really want to remain neutral. You want to make sure you're giving both parties a chance to explain their side and keep the conversation focused on the real issue and not the he said, she said, and the personality issues. So just keep that in mind. You may get caught up in that. I know it's hard not to, but hopefully in your workplace, that's not the kind of culture or environment it's in. You want to, again, take that and transfer it to your chapter board and see how that helps to resolve that. Whether you're the person mediating or you're a person that is part of the conflict, start by listening with each other without interrupting. Funny enough, this morning we had a staff training today, and one of the big topics was active listening. And active listening means you are not interrupting. You're giving that person your full attention. You're engaged. You're not thinking about what you're having for lunch or what you need to do after work. You're there. You're present. So much of our listening, while it is, we always think communication is talking. So much of communication is actually listening and being there and making sure that the other person is speaking is validated because you are listening. Try to show an understanding and an empathy towards that person, just as way that you would hope they would return the favor when it's your turn to speak. Again, you're going to allow both parties to explain their points of view. Everybody's going to get the opportunity to speak. Now, of course, if there's something larger going on within your membership, you're going to need to scale that down. That should really be brought up to the board. Your board members should be given some feedback from your members, and then as a board, they should be able to resolve that. And again, we don't want to be on the defense. We want to be actively listening. We don't want to be using any kind of rebuke. We're going to listen, and we'll get our own opportunity to speak as well. So once both sides have explained, you want to start to negotiate or compromise the process, start identifying some common goals, values, and some common opinions regarding the conflict. It might not all be black and white. So just something to think about when you're compromising. You're going to have to give and take, and that really tends to be the best solution in most cases. Okay, and then of course you're going to need to implement the solution, whatever that may be. Put a quick plan of action together. Hopefully it's not a huge issue where it takes a long time, but something that could be implemented and actionable rather quickly. Once that plan is implemented, depending on the compromise, you want to be sure to evaluate it, make sure that it's successful. If it's not, then you need to reevaluate. Think of a new plan. You'll need to re-implement and then evaluate again, and so on and so forth until you find an effective resolution. So that's just kind of the quick conflict resolution. I didn't want to spend a ton of time on it because I do actually want to pass over things to Omar and ask him, how did you breathe new life into your board? How did you make that culture shift? How did you do so without sort of, lowering morale? I know a lot of times people with change, not only in our work environments, they have a hard time adjusting to that and sometimes have some negative feelings about that. So how did you overcome that, from where you started to where your chapter is today?
Yeah, so I will tell you, it did not come without
if you haven't been to Methodist,
a little bit of heartache.
You'll be amazed at the transformation.
What in the world? I'm sorry, hold on.
Our recent renovations are simply beautiful.
Hold on a second.
Welcoming staff have helped make Jenny Southwest Iowa's premier healthcare facility. We hope you enjoy our new look as much as we do.
Can everybody else hear that?
While visiting any Methodist Jenny Edmondson facility, you may notice that our employees go out of their way to say hello or help you find your way. These standards of compassionate service are set by our employees themselves and
see if we
define
can
what
mute
the
some
meaning of
folks.
caring truly means. We're proud of our commitment of caring and are happy to prove it every time you visit. The rhythm of your life centers on the rhythm of your heart. Methodist Jenny Edmondson, we help you find the
If everyone can just mute their phone, I'm trying to go through and mute some folks.
Technology and equipment that enables doctors to get the rhythm of your life.
I'm not sure where that's coming from.
Whoever it is, it's an hour.
Okay, I think we're all good, so you can jump back in whenever you're ready, Omar.
All right, so that was actually a good segue to conflict resolution. People, when you start talking, people don't want to hear what you have to say. They tune you out. That was the background music. So when the background music starts, you have to stay on task, so to speak. Transparency is something I constantly talk about in our chapter, and I'm a firm believer in it. In order to change the culture, you have to be transparent. And in our chapter, we had leaders that had been around for a while. They were great. They did a lot of good things for the chapter. But just like anything else in life, if you do it long enough and you don't think outside of the box or pull the lever, it becomes redundant. That was part of the culture change, was getting the old leaders to understand that it was okay to do something different. And it didn't mean that they didn't do a good job while they were the leaders. It just meant that we were at a different stage where we had to do something different. So that was a challenge. I won't tell you that it wasn't, that it was received very easily by everyone, because it wasn't. But what I did was to really kind of start the whole culture change. Sorry, to get the background. To start the whole culture change was we started with the board, because I knew that going forward, in order to get the chapter engaged, to get the chapter involved, to get the chapter culture to change, we had to change the culture of the board. So I'll give you my story. I ran for president. I was called a goofball. I was called this crazy guy that wanted to come on the board, who came to the meetings and never attended. I was the guy that did come to the meeting. I didn't attend because it was not engaging. It didn't fulfill the needs that I had. And every time I came to the meetings, it was always the same thing recycled over and over again. So I would come to the meetings, sit through the first 2 or 3 sessions, and then it felt like it was a waste of my time. So when I decided to run for the board, the current members of the old board at the time, that's all they knew. So they thought that I would be some guy that would just come in, want to be the president, and then mess everything up. So I had to change and engage them once I was fortunate enough to be elected president, to let them realize that, I'm going to be committed to what I'm doing. I'm going to be committed to the chapter. We can go forward, and we can all work together. Did everybody sing Kumbaya? No. But what happens is, when you're consistent and people start to see change, then everyone comes on board. So, we may have started with 1 or 2 people that were kind of questioning what we were doing. And now I'm happy to say that some of the main people that felt like this guy's an idiot or this guy's a goofball, I didn't take it personally, are now some of the main factors in our chapter. And that came through consistency. That came through following through. That came through thinking out of the box and explaining it to them, and not necessarily always making something seem like it's your idea, but planting the seed, letting it blossom, and then letting them take the lead and get credit for it, or empower them to buy into the vision of what you're doing. So it takes time. I know there's some chapters out there that are going through, growing pains right now, that feel like, we can't get ahead, no matter what we do, we can't progress. You just have to stay on course, stay strong, stick to the message, and people will buy into it.
Great. That's kind of the brief version. I know we're running a little short on time, but so Omar, before you came on, was your leadership kind of the same people? They'd been there doing this for years. Was it that kind of mentality or that culture that had been in place?
We had the same leaders essentially for the last, probably the presidency was passed around for probably the last 12 years, 10 to 12 years.
So the same people always in charge? Same
people always in charge. They just rotated positions.
Okay. So you being elected president really kind of shook that up? Is that what I meant? That's correct, right?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep, it definitely shook it up. Sorry, background. It definitely shook it up. It brought new blood, and just like anything else, new blood is not always a bad thing. But going back to the membership body as a whole, I wasn't the only one that shared some of those views about the value of what our meetings were, what we were getting out of attending the meetings. The membership body was starving for that change. So once we started to implement that change as a board, the membership body immediately were like sponges and absorbing it. It was just a matter of changing the board's perception of what we needed to do.
Great. So I think, how I see it is sort of like this seed was planted. It started with Omar, and then it grew and grew and grew from there. So, I think some of us, from what I gather from our chapter leaders and just in discussions through phone calls and emails, is that you kind of feel helpless. But, you're not. You are capable of making this change, just as Omar has done. Yes, it may be painful at times and challenging at times, but you've got to persevere. And then I think, just as Omar said, you're getting that buy-in. People are going to see, hey, this is working. This is a good improvement. This is better for our chapter. They're afraid of change, but somebody has to be the one who leads the movement. And I think right here is North Carolina is that perfect example that it can be done. So stay positive, persevere, you know, but know that it is possible. So anything else that you would like to add, Omar? Just some of your, you know, best practices in terms of, you know, how you did persevere through that culture shift.
I'm stubborn. I'm being stubborn. And what I mean by being stubborn is, you know, when you ran for office,
Hello? Omar, do we still have you with us?
yeah, I'm back. Sorry, it was my phone.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay.
As a chapter, what I was saying is, as a chapter leader, when we all volunteer to become leaders, we volunteer to help change the chapter, to help lead the chapter to redirection. So, you know, just like being leaders in our department, we face challenges every day, whether it be staffing challenges, whether it be staffing cuts, whether it be administration challenges, no matter what it is, and we still persevere. The one thing about the dietary department and CDM is, no matter what you throw at us, we always come out on top. You know, we may scratch our head, we may work long hours. So take that whole attitude of the CDM and what you do daily to your chapter leadership. And when you have those challenges, utilize what you do daily to help you persevere forward.
Right, exactly. Great. Well, thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Omar? No? Any questions? Well, certainly feel free. If you have questions, you can send them to me, and I'm happy to pass those along to Omar. You know, I think he'd be more than happy to respond to those. So just, you know, when times are tough and things are hard, just, you know, keep that North Carolina chapter in mind that, you know, they've revitalized their board, and yes, they're still learning and finding out new things, but that's kind of the joy in a lot of it. So definitely something to keep in mind as you think about revitalizing your board and making some changes and shaking things up. So if I have no further questions, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Omar, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your experience. I think that's invaluable to many of us on the call. I certainly know that I learned a lot from the first time I had heard about how things had changed in North Carolina. So thank you very, very much for being open and honest about that with us.
I appreciate it. And like Abigail said, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be willing to help at all, any way possible, because the stronger we become as chapters individually around the country, the stronger we become as a unit. And that's part of our longevity.
Yes, exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us on the call. Just some important dates to remember. September 15th, you have a signed affiliate agreement that is due here at National. And then, of course, as we discussed earlier, your proof of attendance at a leadership session. The ACE Awards are now open. They are not due until February 28th of 2018. But again, this does take a little bit of time, so start thinking about if there's somebody that you'd like to nominate. And then there's a cheat sheet available on our website that gives you all of the questions that you'll be expected to answer. So you have some time to formulate those responses ahead of time before you go into the SurveyMonkey to complete the submission. And then mark your calendars for Tuesday, October 24th, our next chapter chat. We're going to be discussing our governing documents, including our policies and procedures and bylaws, which both of those templates have been recently updated, and they are available on ANFP Connect. But we'll go into more detail during that time. Again, thank you to Omar, and thank you for everybody who joined us on the call this afternoon. I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.